The Roman triumph was a civil ceremony and religious rite of ancient Rome, held to publicly celebrate and sanctify the success of a military commander who had led Roman forces to victory in the service of the state, or originally and traditionally, one who had successfully completed a foreign war. On the day of his triumph, the general wore a crown of laurel and the all-purple, gold-embroidered triumphal toga picta, regalia that identified him as near divine or near kingly. He rode in a four-horse chariot through the streets of Rome in unarmed procession with his army, captives and the spoils of his war. At Jupiter's temple on the Capitoline Hill he offered sacrifice and the tokens of his victory to the god. Republican morality required that, despite these extraordinary honors, the general conduct himself with dignified humility. As a mortal citizen who triumphed on behalf of Rome's Senate, people and gods. Inevitably, besides its religious and military dimensions, the triumph offered extraordinary opportunities for self-publicity. While most Roman festivals were calendar fixtures, the tradition and law that reserved the triumph to extraordinary victory ensured that its celebration, procession, attendant feasting and public games promoted the general's status and achievement. By the late Republican era, increasing competition among the military political adventurers who ran Rome's nascent empire ensured that triumphs became more frequent, drawn out and extravagant, prolonged in some cases by several days of public games and entertainments. From the Principate onwards, the triumph reflected the imperial order, and the preeminence of the imperial family. The triumph was consciously imitated by medieval and later states in the royal entry and other ceremonial events. Background and ceremonies. The Vir Triumphalis in Republican Rome, truly exceptional military achievement, merited the highest possible honors, which connected the Vir Triumphalis to Rome's mythical and semi-mythical past. In effect, the general was close to being king for a day, and possibly close to divinity. He wore the regalia traditionally associated both with the ancient Roman monarchy and with the statue of Jupiter Capitolinus. The purple and gold toga picta, laurel crown, red boots and, again possibly, the red painted face of Rome's supreme deity. He was drawn in procession through the city, in a four-horse chariot, under the gaze of his peers and an applauding crowd, to the temple of Capitoline Jupiter. The spoils and captives of his victory led the way, his armies followed behind. Once at the Capitoline temple, he sacrificed 2 white oxen to Jupiter and laid tokens of his victory at his feet, dedicating his victory to the Roman Senate, people and gods. Triumphs were tied to no particular day, season or religious festival of the Roman calendar. Most seem to have been celebrated at the earliest practicable opportunity, probably on days that were deemed auspicious for the occasion. Tradition required that for the duration of a triumph, every temple was open. The ceremony was thus, in some sense, shared by the whole community of Roman gods, but overlaps with specific festivals and anniversaries were inevitable. Some may have been coincidental, others were designed. For example, March 1st, the festival and dies natalis of the war god, Mars, was the traditional anniversary of the first and 6 other Republican triumphs, and of the very first Roman triumph. Pompey postponed his third, most magnificent triumph for several months, to make it coincide with his own dies natalis. Religious dimensions aside, the focus of the triumph was the general himself. The ceremony promoted him, however temporarily, above every mortal Roman. This was an opportunity granted to very few. From the time of Scipio Africanus, the triumphal general was linked, at least for historians during the Principate, to Alexander and the demi-god Hercules, who had labored selflessly for the benefit of all mankind. His sumptuous triumphal chariot was bedecked with charms against the possible envy and malice of onlookers. In some accounts, a companion or public slave would, from time to time, remind him of his own mortality. The procession. Rome's earliest triumphs were probably simple victory parades. celebrating the return of a victorious general and his army to the city, along with the fruits of his victory, and ending with some form of dedication to the gods. This is probably so for the earliest legendary and later semi-legendary triumphs of Rome's regal era, when the king functioned as Rome's highest magistrate and war leader. As Rome's population, power, influence and territory increased, so did the scale, length, variety and extravagance of its triumphal processions. The procession mustered in the open space of the Campus Martius probably well before first light. From there, all unforeseen delays and accidents aside, it would have managed a slow walking pace at best, punctuated by various planned stops en route to its final destination, the Capitoline Temple, a distance of just under 4 kilometers. Triumphal processions were notoriously long and slow. The longest could last for 2 or 3 days, and possibly more, and some may have been of greater length than the route itself. Some ancient and modern sources suggest a fairly standard processional order. First, the captive leaders, allies and soldiers, and sometimes their families, usually walking in chains. Some were destined for execution or further display. Their captured weapons, armor, gold, silver, statuary, and curious or exotic treasures were carted behind them, along with paintings, tableaus and models depicting significant places and episodes of the war. Next in line, all on foot, came Rome's senators and magistrates, followed by the generals lictors in their red war robes, their fasces wreathed in laurel, then the general in his 4-horse chariot. A companion, or a public slave, might share the chariot with him, or in some cases, his youngest children. His officers and elder sons rode horseback nearby. His unarmed soldiers followed, in togas and laurel crowns, chanting, "Io Triumph," and singing ribald songs at their general's expense. Somewhere in the procession, 2 flawless white oxen, garland-decked and with gilded horns, were led for the sacrifice to Jupiter. All this, to the accompaniment of music, clouds of incense and the strewing of flowers. Almost nothing is known of the procession's infrastructure and management. Its doubtless enormous cost was defrayed in part by the state but mostly by the general's loot, which most ancient sources dwell on in great detail and unlikely superlatives. Once disposed, this portable wealth injected huge sums into the Roman economy. The amount brought in by Octavian's triumph over Egypt triggered a fall in interest rates, and a sharp rise in land prices. No ancient source addresses the logistics of the procession, where the soldiers and captives in a procession of several days could have slept, ate and drank, or where these several thousands, plus the spectators, could have been stationed for the final ceremony at the Capitoline Temple. The following schematic for the route taken by some, or many, triumphs is based on standard modern reconstructions. Any original or traditional route would have been diverted to some extent by the city's many redevelopments and rebuildings, or sometimes by choice. The starting place lay outside the city's sacred boundary, on the western bank of the Tiber. The procession entered the city through a Porta Triumphalis, and crossed the Pomerium, where the general surrendered his command to the Senate and magistrates. It continued through the site of the Circus Flaminius, skirting the southern base of the Capitoline Hill and the Velabrum, along a Via Triumphalis towards the Circus Maximus, perhaps dropping off any prisoners destined for execution at the Tullianum. It entered the Via Sacra, then the Forum. Finally, it ascended the Capitoline Hill to the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. Once the sacrifice and dedications were completed, the procession and spectators dispersed to banquets, games and other entertainments sponsored by the triumphing general. Banquets, games and entertainments. In most triumphs, the general funded any post-procession banquets from his share of the loot. There were feasts for the people, and separate, much richer feasts for the elite. Some went on for most of the night. Dionysius offers a contrast to the lavish triumphal banquets of his time by giving Romulus's triumph the most primitive possible banquet, ordinary, Romans setting up food tables as a welcome home, and the returning troops taking swigs and bites as they marched by. He recreates the first Republican triumphal banquet along the same lines. Varro claims that his aunt earned 20,000 sesterces by supplying 5,000 thrushes for Caius Aelius Metellus's triumph of 71 BCE. Some triumphs included ludi, as fulfillment of the general's vow before battle, or during its heat, to a god or goddess in return for their help in securing victory. In the Republic they were paid for by the triumphing general. Marcus Fulvius Nobilia vowed ludi in return for victory over the Aetolian League and paid for 10 days of games at his triumph. Commemoration. Most Romans would never have seen a triumph, but its symbolism permeated Roman imagination and material culture. Triumphal generals minted and circulated high-value coins to propagate their triumphal fame and generosity empire-wide. Pompey's issues for his 3 triumphs are typical. 1. An aureus has a laurel-wreathed border enclosing a head that personifies Africa. Beside it, Pompey's title, Magnus, with wand and jug as symbols of his augury. The reverse identifies him as proconsul, in a triumphal chariot attended by victory. A triumphal denarius shows his 3 trophies of captured arms, with his augurs, wand and jug. Another shows a globe surrounded by triumphal wreaths, symbolizing his world conquest, and an ear of grain, to show that his victory protected Rome's grain supply. In Republican tradition, a general was expected to wear his triumphal regalia only for the day of his triumph. Thereafter, they were presumably displayed in the atrium of his family home. As one of the nobility, he was entitled to a particular kind of funeral, in which a string of actors walked behind his bier, wearing the masks of his ancestors. Another actor represented the general himself, and his highest achievement in life, by wearing his funeral mask, triumphal laurels and toga picta. Anything more was deeply suspect. Pompey, granted the privilege of wearing his triumphal wreath at the circus, met with a hostile reception. Julius Caesar's penchant for wearing his triumphal regalia, wherever and whenever, was taken as one among many signs of monarchic intentions which, for some, justified his murder. In the imperial era, emperors wore such regalia to signify their elevated rank and office, and identify themselves with the Roman gods and imperial order, a central feature of imperial cult. The building and dedication of monumental public works offered local, permanent opportunities for triumphal commemoration. Some examples follow. In 55 BCE, Pompey inaugurated Rome's first stone-built theatre as a gift to the people of Rome, funded by his spoils. Its gallery and colonnades doubled as an exhibition space, and likely contained statues, paintings and other trophies carried at his various triumphs. It contained a new temple to Pompey's patron goddess, Venus Victrix. The year before, he had issued a coin that showed her crowned with triumphal laurels. Julius Caesar, who claimed Venus as both patron and divine ancestress, funded a new temple to her, and dedicated it during his quadruple triumph of 46 BCE. He thus wove his patron goddess and putative ancestress into his triumphal anniversary. Augustus, Caesar's heir and Rome's first emperor, built a vast triumphal monument on the Greek coast at Actium, overlooking the scene of his decisive sea battle against Antony and Egypt. The bronze beaks of captured Egyptian warships projected from its seaward wall. Starting with the Augustan reinvention of Rome as a virtual monarchy, imperial iconography increasingly identified emperors with the gods. Sculpted panels on the Arch of Titus celebrate Titus and Vespasian's joint triumph over the Jews after the siege of Jerusalem, with a triumphal procession of captives, and treasures seized from the Temple of Jerusalem, some of which funded the building of the Colosseum. Another panel shows the funeral and apotheosis of the deified Titus. Prior to this, the Senate voted Titus of Triple Arch at the Circus Maximus to celebrate or commemorate the same victory or triumph. Awarding a triumph. In Republican tradition, only the Senate could grant a triumph. A general who wanted a triumph would dispatch his request and report to the Senate. Officially, triumphs were granted for outstanding military merit, if this and certain other conditions were met, and these seem to have varied from time to time, and from case to case. The state paid for the ceremony, or at least, for the official procession. Most Roman historians rest the outcome on an open senatorial debate and vote. Its legality confirmed by one of the people's assemblies, the Senate, and people thus controlled the state's coffers and rewarded or curbed its generals. Some triumphs seem to have been granted outright, with minimal debate. Some were turned down but went ahead anyway, with the general's direct appeal to the people over the Senate and a promise of public games at his own expense. Others were blocked, or granted only after interminable wrangling. Senators and generals alike were politicians, and Roman politics was notorious for its rivalries, shifting alliances, backroom dealings and overt public bribery. The Senate's discussions would likely have hinged on triumphal tradition, precedent and propriety, less overtly but more anxiously on the extent of the general's political and military powers and popularity, and the possible consequences of supporting or hindering his further career. There is no firm evidence that the Senate applied a prescribed set of triumphal laws when making their decisions. During the Principate, triumphs became more politicized as manifestations of imperial authority and legitimacy. Ovation: a general might be granted a lesser triumph, known as an ovation. He entered the city minus his troops, on foot, in his magistrate's toga, wearing a wreath of Venice's myrtle. In 211 BCE, the Senate turned down Marcellus's request for a triumph after his victory over the Carthaginians and their Sicilian Greek allies, apparently because his army was still in Sicily and unable to join him. They offered him instead of thanksgiving an ovation. The day before it, he celebrated an unofficial triumph on the Alban Mount. His ovation was of triumphal proportions. It included a large painting, showing his siege of Syracuse, the siege engines themselves, captured plate, gold, silver and royal ornaments, and the statuary and opulent furniture for which Syracuse was famous. 8 elephants were led in the procession, symbols of his victory over the Carthaginians. His Spanish and Syracusan allies led the way, wearing golden wreaths. They were granted Roman citizenship and lands in Sicily. In 71 BCE, Crassus earned an ovation for quashing the Spartacus revolt, and upped his honors by wearing a crown of Jupiter's triumphal laurel. Ovations are listed along with triumphs on the Fasta Triumphales.